everyone. My name is Brent. I'm the host for Canadians with Disabilities and their Allies. And today I have Caryma joining me on the show here. Good afternoon, Caryma. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So there's definitely lots to talk about today. It's always a great pleasure having wonderful guests like yourself on my show and talking about the pressing issues that are affecting people with disabilities and across our nation.
I look forward to tackling what we can.
Definitely. So, Caryma, can you tell me, first off, how did you get started in your position?
Sure. So I'm a lawyer and I'm a sole practitioner. I do mostly landlord-tenant stuff with a small criminal practice. Kind of the journey to law school was motivated by wanting to better understand how the world works and the rules kind of underlying it. And then sort of it was its own journey. I spent a little bit of time, like my articling period, doing litigation on Bay Street. It wasn't really my jam. And then the criminal and housing work came about because I basically just started going to court to observe proceedings, thinking that that's how I would learn. And I did learn a lot, and I made connections. And through that, I got my first case, which was an LTD matter. And kind of the tribunal, like the landlord-tenant board, it's definitely fast-paced, and you're dealing with real people and real issues. And there's a lot of advocacy in that. So I found that appealing and kind of honed in on that as a niche. And that's been my life for the past 5 years or so.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of work, and definitely, so especially with dealing with landlords and tenants, like on eviction issues too. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that for sure.
Yeah, it's intense because it's people's homes, right? And so it's inherently emotional, whether I'm representing a landlord or a tenant. And the stakes are high, yet the tribunal itself, try what they might to ensure that there's procedural fairness for people, meaning everyone has, a fair shot at presenting their case and kind of doing so in a timely manner. There are delays built into the system, and just people who easily can fall through the cracks. So in that sense, it's it can be a bit bleak, and especially knowing sort of the background, the landscape that we're operating in, right? The housing market in Canada and the way that rent or market rent has increased really exponentially compared to people's income, and that's especially true where someone's on a fixed income. So I practice exclusively in Ontario for housing matters, and in Ontario we have a rule called vacancy decontrol, which basically means you have rent control while you're living somewhere and it's a valid tenancy. But once you move out, the landlord can set the rent at, in the same unit at whatever price they choose. And often they'll do that to match market rates. So, the most, I guess, distressing scenario that I encounter with relative frequency is people who have been living somewhere for a long time and are now faced with eviction. And the prospect of moving, it's almost overwhelmingly impossible, because to find something at the same rate for similar accommodations, generally a non-starter, and even to downgrade, the amount that someone brings in for ODSP, for example, typically won't cover a single bedroom unit. So, that could mean making changes to lifestyle, having to have roommates. That's not always possible depending on someone's circumstances, or leaving the city, your neighborhood or community. But the problem is province-wide. So there is no real escaping the fact that we treat housing like an investment instead of housing as a basic commodity that people need. So, it's that's at the root of what's going on. And I don't really see a clear solution that is palatable, I think, to politicians.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a growing problem for sure across Ontario and across all of Canada. Where, yeah, you're definitely right. I mean, as soon as somebody leaves out of their current tenancy agreement, they fulfill their agreement and they leave. And yes, there's a lot of landlords. They'll just flip the unit over without even renovating. I mean, they may touch something up and then fully say it's fully renovated where it's not, and they can jack up the rent to like $600-700, even $1,000 if they wanted to, what the market will bear. And in people on fixed incomes, yeah, they will be displaced. They will become homeless, and no fault of their own, because the governments are not meeting their obligation to the CRPD. And with that being said, I was just wondering if you could maybe talk about the updates to the tribunal that may impact the PWD.
Sure. I would say the major change to what's going on right now is that basically all hearings are done virtually. So it used to be that you would have to go into the landlord tenant board, or if you're in a city where, there isn't a permanent tribunal, they might have kind of a rented conference hall or hotel lobby or Legion or whatever, and it would be done in person. And that presented its own issues for certain people with disabilities, depending on the nature of their disabilities. But now what we're facing is everything is virtual, which means that the exchange of documents, that needs to happen in a certain time frame, whereas previously it would be done the morning of. If those deadlines aren't met, if someone doesn't have the technological capabilities, or a steady Wi-Fi connection, or even minutes on their cell phone, sometimes that can preclude someone from participating, especially because the way it works is you get a hearing date, and you're told to log in at a certain time, but there's no guarantee that you'll actually be heard right then and there. And in fact, usually it happens later in the day. So you're stuck kind of listening to everything else that's going on. And, that's not always possible for people to do. And difficulties with Zoom, kind of figuring out how to log in the first place, even if you're doing it by phone. And these aren't issues that exclusively affect people with disabilities, but the board does have mechanisms where it's supposed to accommodate depending on someone's needs as expressed. Even to apply for those accommodations, though, that's still a virtual process. So that, I think, is the biggest change, sort of, I'll say post-pandemic, although that might be optimistic, but that's what we're facing, and it looks like they're going to remain virtual for the foreseeable future, and possibly indefinitely.
Yeah, definitely a lot of changes that COVID has brought to the inequalities in life. As we know, it's really exposed a lot of the problems and what PWD and people in general in life, what they're going through, and especially with affordability. It's with the cost of the inflation, they say national average 8.1%. Well, I mean, that's just an average. I mean, the prices are just outrageously high, like up to 30-40% in some cases. And of course, people on fixed incomes, then they end up paying the majority of their income to rent, because it's not rent geared to income. Some may say that, which is good in some cases, but there's also a drawback with that too, because then it's more about government control, right? Because now you have to prove the reason why you need rent geared to income, rather than them just increasing the rates up to a standard level where people can choose to live where they want to live. I just wanted your take on that part.
I mean, one thing about rent geared to income is to even be eligible, like there's a lengthy wait list, right? Mm-hmm. So that doesn't apply if you're in sort of private housing. whether it's government, again, in Toronto, which is where I'm based, we have Toronto Community Housing, and then, there's housing corporations in different municipalities. And RGI applies to them or to certain co-ops, but it's not like an easy, straightforward process where you fill in a form and submit it, and now you're paying rent geared to income. So it's a small sliver of people who have access to that, and you're absolutely right that it creates a power dynamic where if there are, for example, repair or maintenance issues or harassment issues that a tenant is dealing with, they are between a rock and a hard place to get that resolved, right? Because you can exert as much pressure on the landlord as possible, and they may or may not be responsive, but the notion of being targeted for speaking out, that's a real phenomenon, and it's not supposed to happen, and there are protections written into the law that governs Ontario tenancies that are supposed to protect tenants from retaliation or a landlord blacklisting you. But practically speaking, it's a legitimate concern. So I mean, that's kind of my thoughts there, where I don't know that the solution is that government runs all housing, because there are serious bureaucratic and operational issues with Toronto Community Housing, which is effectively, one of the largest landlords with all of its holdings. But by the same token, it being primarily private landlords who are responsible for keeping people housed, for them it's a business proposition, and that business proposition is unattractive if someone is paying less rent. So that's the conundrum that we're facing. And same deal, or I should add actually to my previous comment, when I talked about longstanding tenants having to move and are now entering this inhospitable rental market, it can be a combination of things. There are situations where a tenant is completely not at fault, and that may be a landlord wanting to move in for themselves, or they've sold the property and the purchaser is moving in, or there are major renovations to be done, or it's being demolished or converted. And that's, a scenario where a tenant can't really control the circumstances around them. And then there's other situations, where it's a fault eviction. It might be because of arrears in rent or late payment of rent. It could be that someone, is interfering with others, and there are times where that ties into disability, in hoarding cases, for example, or where there are mental health issues that result in, behavior that either is or is perceived as threatening or disruptive to others. And those are the types of evictions that people are undergoing. And because lists are so long, there's not really a safety net between being evicted and sort of where you go next. And housing is so crucial to people's well-being that it's a missing piece of the puzzle. And where you take away someone's housing, it certainly is not going to improve any other aspect of their life. Discrimination based on income is a real barrier to getting housing in the first place, because a landlord is thinking ahead, well, I don't want to be stuck with a situation that isn't beneficial or profitable to me, and I'm thinking long term, and it could be very long term. So that it can weed people out right before they even get into a place. And there are very limited remedies to deal with that, in part because it's the burden of the applicant to show that they were in fact discriminated against. And because there's so much competition, that's a tall order to prove that.